me droning on about the local plan for a change. So this is the member planning training, and we've got two speakers for you today. I think are going to share their presentation. We've got Helen Fielding, who is the Director of Development and Investment at Broadacres Housing Association based in Northallerton. And we've got Sharon Graham, who is the Housing Strategy Manager at North Yorkshire Council. So welcome to both of you. And it's going to be a little bit different, really, actually handing over to somebody who's actually involved with building housing rather than what I seem to be involved with, which is kind of talking about it all the time. So I'd like to just hand over really to Sharon and Helen, and I'm sure there will be time for a discussion and questions afterwards. So if I can hand over to them, I will monitor the chat as well. If members want to write down any questions, I'll monitor that, and we can bring that into the discussion after the presentation. Okay, over to Helen and Sharon.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for the opportunity to come to talk to you today. So Peter asked if we would, or between us, provide a bit of a update, not just in terms of some information about what's happening in terms of North Yorkshire Council and affordable housing, the rural housing enablers since local government reorganisation, but also just explain a little bit about the rural housing enablers and how they work, and touching on rural exception sites. So that's what I'm going to try and do today, and Helen's going to finish off with some slides just talking through things from a slightly different perspective in terms of the RP side of things, the housing association side of things, and looking at some real-time examples of the kind of people that we're trying to help through delivering new affordable homes in the park. So I'm really sorry I couldn't actually get to fathom the tech in terms of sharing my slides. So I'm going to have to do that really awful thing and keep saying next slide, please. So Rebecca, thank you for helping out, and please get out the next slide. Oh, I can't. It's not moved on for me.
Apologies, yeah, it's not. Why is it not doing that? I think because the other control bar covers up the arrow, and I was using the.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, we can probably go on to the next one because I think I just sort of went through that. So just very quickly, this is for those of you that aren't familiar. I'm aware that a lot of you probably are, but maybe not everybody is. There's a new directorate within the council at North Yorkshire since local government reorganisation, and it's the Community Development Directorate that is headed up by Nick Hahn. And he's got a senior management team shown on slides there, but I'm just going to focus on the front and centre there, Andrew Rowe, who's the AD for housing. And if we could bob on to the next slide. Andrew has a management team in place. So he has 5 heads of service. So Lorraine is head of homes and places. So she covers the sort of asset management side. So the council is now a landlord. So previously Richmondshire would have had some housing stock of its own, but Craven didn't, just thinking in terms of North Yorkshire side of the national park. And Harrogate also had some stock. So together, those 3 stock holding councils after LGR have come together as one single landlord. And there's about 8,400 homes. So Lorraine is in charge of the sort of asset management, which is the repairs and maintenance side of things, and also working on the new build programme. So the council does actually have a programme of developing its own council homes. And Councillor Myers, who's our lead member for housing, is very ambitious around wanting to grow that programme. We've got Lynn Williams, who's head of housing renewal. So Lynn deals with all things private sector housing, which is really big deal in terms of retrofit. And we know that the stock conditions worsen private sector, whether that be private rented sector or owner occupation. So there's some really big challenges there. And then also heads up, she used to manage the Home Improvement Agency at Scarborough and Rydale. So that delivers all the disabled facilities grants, and that's going to be kind of rolled out across North Yorkshire, bringing together all the former DFG programmes from the districts and boroughs. Kim Ribbleshaw is the head of housing needs, so that's housing options, homelessness, housing advice. Carl Doolan is the head of landlord services, so that's the housing management side of things, dealing with all the council's tenancies. And Hannah Heineman has recently been appointed as the head of housing delivery and partnerships. So Hannah's only been in post for about a month. Hannah's area covers all the sort of development side of things and housing strategy. So she's got quite a big portfolio of work to get cracking on. There's lots of emerging and new projects, and the Rural Housing Enabler team sit within Hannah's area of the service. If I could have the next slide, please. So I thought it would maybe be helpful just to kick off, and I'm really sorry if this is all teaching you to suck eggs and that you know the NPPF inside out, but I found it quite helpful to just revisit what does the National Planning Policy Framework actually say about what affordable housing is. So it's housing for sale or rent for those whose needs are not met by the market, including housing that provides a subsidised route to home ownership and or is for essential local workers, and which complies with one or more of the following definitions. So if we could knock it onto the next slide. So briefly, that's affordable housing for rent. So that could be social rent or affordable rent. So the latter, affordable rent, is classed as being affordable up to 80% of the market rent. And where the landlord is a registered provider and there is what we would call perpetuity provisions in place. So the home is going to be available for successive occupiers long term. Start homes, as defined by the Housing and Planning Act 2016, I think they kind of never really got off the ground and have subsequently really been replaced by first homes. Discounted market sales housing at least 20% below open market value, and that's linked to critically their local house prices and incomes. And again, the perpetuity clauses apply there, and that needs to be secured through the planning permission. Other routes, primarily rent to buy or shared ownership, is that category. So that's what NPPF says. And if we could move on to the next slide. I thought it might be helpful just in that context, because we talk about links to house prices and incomes, to get a feel for what that looks like. I know this is very generic, it's just a price for North Yorkshire and it's probably not that helpful, but it gives a scale of where North Yorkshire house prices sit in terms of the median house price, so that's that midpoint house price. In terms of North Yorkshire is 250,000. This was as of September 2022. And then the Yorkshire and Humber figure is 185,000. And if we compare that to the next slide, which shows incomes, you'll see that the median workplace-based earnings there for North Yorkshire is under 30,000, 29,463, as opposed to Yorkshire and Humber, which is 30,000. So you can see the challenge for working households in trying to access accommodation, particularly homes to buy in North Yorkshire. If I could have the next slide, please. This sort of gives you a flavour of the spread of affordability challenges across the patch. When we look at North Yorkshire, this is based on the former district and borough areas. This is how the data's available at the moment. So you'll see that even in those areas that are slightly more affordable in the North Yorkshire context, so that's Selby and Scarborough, you're still looking around an affordability ratio of 7, whereas Rydale, it's pushing up towards 11 and Harrogate's around 10. But for the former Richmondshire locality, the most recent figures show about an affordability ratio of about 8 and Craven of 9. I think it's worth just saying that the Richmondshire figures are skewed by Catterick, so when you're thinking about it in terms of the national park, that figure will be higher. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So the North and East Yorkshire RHE, or Rural Housing Enabler Partnership, what is it? So it's a long-standing partnership. It's been in place, as some of you I'm sure are aware, for more than 15 years. It's got a track record of delivery, and there's a dedicated team of rural housing enablers embedded within the local council. So that's North and East Yorkshire across the patch, working closely with planning colleagues on local plans. That includes both the Yorkshire Dales National Park and North York Moors National Park. It's a nationally recognised model to the extent that Homes England actually provided us with some revenue grant funding towards the end of the last financial year to help support the programme through the transition to local government, through the transition of local government reorganisation, as we look to review and work out how we can continue the programme going forward. The Rural Housing Enablers are funded by the local authorities and the national parks, as well as about 15 housing association partners. So if I could have the next slide, please. What do Rural Housing Enablers actually do then? So Rural Housing Enablers are nationally, work across the country. We're very unusual in that as a local authority, we actually employ our own RHEs. And we've got probably the most sustainable programme of RHEs across the country, which is why it's been a very well regarded model. So an RHE is there to be that, if you like, honest broker, to act between different parties to help find solutions, bring forward sites that meet identified need for affordable housing. So they'll help explore site options to find one that works best in any given scenario, be that for the local community, the landowner, and also the planning authority, and complies with all the requisite planning requirements. They'll undertake local housing needs surveys, also provide initial advice on site suitability, either to a landowner, to an RP partner, to the parish council. They'll encourage and facilitate parish council and community engagement. So regularly we'll hold open days and do community consultation events. And they'll help to find a housing association or registered provider, depending whether you're talking old money or not, that the landowner feels comfortable working with and that community are happy to work alongside as well. They'll explain how the planning, funding and viability and allocations processes work. And they'll help landowners explore how they can retain land ownership and have nomination rights for some of the affordable homes, if that's something that will help bring a scheme forward. And I think that key pivotal point is that liaison point between the local planning authority and the housing authority, which is particularly relevant in the context of the national park. Next slide, please. So who are the rural housing enablers in North Yorkshire and East Riding? So I manage the team, and we have rural housing enablers covering the old district and borough localities, with the exception of Harrogate in North Yorkshire. So that's Angela Walmsley, works across the old Hambledon locality. Amanda Maddens covering the Richmondshire locality. Andrew covers the Craven locality. Colin Hubie covers Rydell and Scarborough. Matthew Brown Selby, and David covers East Riding. And if I could move on to the next slide. I thought it might be helpful just to sort of set that in context. So when we're talking about delivery of rural housing, particularly rural affordable housing, there are two main pathways, and this is really relevant at the moment in the context of where you're going with the local plan for the Dales. So there's the local plan allocated sites, where you'll have a site allocated through the local plan, and that's to deliver a mix of market and affordable homes. And those schemes are privately financed. The affordable housing is secured through a Section 106 agreement and is often referred to as planning gain, or it's the contribution that the developer has to make to meet the planning balance in terms of affordable housing. So the affordable homes are delivered without grant, and the big challenge, I think, as you'll be very familiar with the experiences you've had, is that you're very much, it's very much down to how the developer brings that site forward. They can quite often get stalled, and there's often viability challenges linked to delivery of the affordable housing, and it can end up with a lower level of affordable housing than maybe you would have hoped to get through your local plan policy. And then on the right of the slide is the rural exception side. So this is really where the rural housing enabler comes into their own. It's not normally a site considered for development. It's 100% affordable to meet the local needs, and is, as we always, has access to grant funding from Homes England to make the scheme viable. And often the local housing authority can put in additional funding that they may have through Section 106 affordable housing contributions to top up as well, because rural exception sites do tend to be quite expensive. And that lighter blue bit in the middle, really, that's the bit about, how we work together. So it's all about how, the enablers, if you like, are the key things that we need to make these schemes work. So there's, the landowners, developers, housing associations, could be community-led housing organisations, and the rural housing enablers acting in that supportive role, and the community-led housing hub very much trying to work with those different groups and constituent members to deliver affordable homes via whatever route. If I could have the next slide. Okay, so I thought it would be helpful to again go back to planning guidance and see what it actually says about rural exception sites, because you kind of use the term so often, you then forget what it actually says in the guidance. So the planning policy guidance, national planning policy guidance, says that a rural exception site is used for affordable housing in perpetuity, where sites would not normally be used for housing. Rural exception sites seek to address the needs of the local community by accommodating households who are either current residents or have an existing family or employment connection. A proportion of the market homes may be allowed on the site at the local planning authority's discretion, for example, where essential to enable the delivery of affordable units without grant funding. But predominantly, a rural exception site is 100% affordable housing site to meet local needs. And NPPF states, that the local planning authority should really consider rural exception sites and support opportunities to bring them forward. So that's something that's really pertinent for where you are at with your local plan at the minute. Next slide. So I tried to summarise here, well, how does it work? And I don't know if I've been very successful. I tried to show with the sort of the green arrows at the top and the bottom, when things work well, parish councils involved throughout the process, and ideally a housing association partner, so that we've got open dialogue to and fro. I think often you'll see a rural exception site flow chart that sets things out very schematically as a fluid process from A to B. I think in practice, there's often overlaying in a lot of connectivity between those first elements of a scheme. So it's not always that we would do a housing needs survey first. It might be that somebody comes to us with a site and says, oh, I've got this site. Is it suitable for a rural exception site? In which case we would look to talk with the parish council and the local planning authority, have some initial pre-applications discussions, see if it's a suitable site, and then maybe go and do a needs survey. But there are instances where we will have done a needs survey working with the parish council, and then we'll go out with the planning authority to try and identify a site, do a parish walkabout, trying to come up with a site. And then follow that up with some more detailed pre-application discussions and look to agree a land deal. So I think those first 4 phases, they're sort of fairly fluid, and obviously the land deal is influenced by what comes out of the pre-app discussions and the evidence of need, and vice versa. But once we've got those things in place, we've identified need, we've got a site that planners seem to be happy with, and the RP or the housing association is happy with, and a land deal's agreed, then the key step is getting that planning permission secured. We can then go through to let a build contract. The homes are built out, and then they're let in accordance with that local lettings policy. So the local lettings policy will prioritise the parish. And then if it's been based on a cluster survey, which is what we sometimes do, where we'll cluster a group of parishes together to identify need, and then look to identify a site. It widens that scope to search for a site, come up with a suitable site, and we can maybe do a slightly larger development, maybe identify more need, and that makes it all more viable. So the homes are let in accordance with the local lettings policy in perpetuity, and the homes are managed in line with that and let in line with that. And I think it's just important to emphasise that throughout the process, particularly those early stages, when we're doing a needs survey, and also when we've got some initial sketch layout or plans, we would look to have a lot of community engagement and consultation, ideally open days, and it can be quite an iterative process and it can take quite a long time. So I hope that's helpful. Schemes are all unique and they're all individual and they don't follow a set path, but they're some of the headline key stages that we would look to work through to deliver a rural exception site. Next slide, please. So rural exception sites are many things. There's a piece of research done by UCL and English Rural just recently released, and I'm sure Peter can share the link with you if you'd be interested to read it. The research said that rural exception sites are different and can help to provide an extension of the already existing community, and it really advocates for rural exception sites and highlights some of the things that nationally need to be done to help champion rural exception sites, really. But they're challenging to deliver. They're certainly not a quick fix, and they're very expensive as well. But they enable sustainable communities. And actually, in the context of North Yorkshire, where only 2% of North Yorkshire is actually urban and the remainder is rural, they're actually critical, and we should see them as an important route of supply of affordable housing and a way of ensuring our communities are sustainable. And they bridge the gap between local incomes and house prices. And I think I would just say that never forget or underestimate how life-changing having a safe, secure, affordable home is for somebody, because it is really, it can make all the difference to a family. Next slide, please. And I thought it'd just be nice to end on some images of some rural affordable homes. So some of these are on exception sites. The one on the right is West Witton, which was an allocated site, and some Section 106 affordable housing. But certainly the four on the left are rural exception sites. And I think it's at the end of my slides. Are we over to Helen now?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you and we can
That's
see
great.
your first slide, Helen.
Sorry, I was gabbing away there on mute. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. Peter's already introduced me, but I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Helen Fielding. I'm the Director of Development and Investment at Broadacres Housing Association. I'll just say a little bit about Broadacres. We are headquartered in North Yorkshire. We've been around for about 30 years, got plans to be around for many, many more years. We have a stock holding of around 6,800 homes, and we've been proud supporters and founder members of the Rural Housing Enabling Network since the beginning. We have an ambition corporately to be the best rural housing association, and we see ourselves as playing a central role in North Yorkshire, providing much needed new affordable housing for local people to sustain our rural communities and our rural economies. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit this afternoon about the view from the coalface, if you will, how it feels to deliver some affordable housing across our rural parts of our beautiful county of North Yorkshire, and some of the practicalities around that. And I thought you might be also interested in some research that we've carried out into who's buying our shared ownership homes, because we offer at Broadacres two different main types of affordable housing opportunities. We offer the much needed social and affordable rented homes, and Sharon's already shared information there about the true extent to which people who live and work locally are priced out of local housing markets. You know, in our rural areas particularly, we operate in quite a low wage economy, agricultural, tourism, often seasonal work. But our house prices, and I think in recent years since the COVID pandemic, this has become even more prevalent. Our house prices are rocketing away, aren't they? Because we live in such a beautiful part of the world. Everybody wants to come and live here. And we've seen really the impact of second homes, holiday cottages, Airbnb, as well as people retiring or relocating to the countryside, really pushing up house prices and making what was, I would say, a crisis of affordability even worse. So we have some extraordinary statistics now about the extent to which ordinary working local people are unable to buy their own homes in the way that perhaps we were when we were younger, and certainly our parents were. So there's a huge demand for social housing, and the submarket rented housing that we offer is offered on a needs assessed basis, and we're partners in the choice-based letting system of allocation. And I think at current time of speaking, there's over 8,000 people eligible and registered and seeking social and affordable housing across North Yorkshire. So, you know, the more of that we can build, the better. But there's also a very real aspiration amongst our communities for people to own their own homes. I own my own home. Most of the people that I know, my friends and family, are in the process or own their own home, and it's entirely reasonable and justifiable that people would want to own their own home, with all the associated security that brings. So we do offer a sub-market home ownership product called Shared Ownership, which offers people on modest incomes the opportunity to get that foot on the housing ladder, if you will. It's a part rent, part buy opportunity. It is a product that's eligible for grant funding through Homes England. And so it's a way for people who haven't got the means to be able to raise mortgages or raise the necessary deposits to access full open market ownership to nonetheless start to realise their home ownership dreams. So under new arrangements, it's possible to start your home ownership journey with owning as little as 10% of the equity on your home. And you pay a rent to the landlord, to Broadacres in our case, for the unsold part of the equity. And then as your circumstances change, it's possible to buy more and more chunks of equity over time until, in all but homes in the most rural area where there does exist a rural restriction, it is possible to what we call staircase, which is that process of buying additional chunks of equity. It is possible to staircase to full ownership, whereby the home becomes your own, you have no rental liability to anyone, and you're able to then proceed at will. So we offer the shared ownership product across North Yorkshire, and it's very, very popular. We find that there's a huge demand for it. And what you see on the screen in front of you is a word cloud that I've created from the employment, the jobs that the people that are buying our shared ownership product have. And you can see that there's a real mix there. I mean, some words that I pick out: assistant. So the home ownership product that we offer does mean that it gives people who wouldn't be able to access open market housing in their own right the opportunity to get that foot on the ladder. So we see people that are perhaps at quite early stages in their careers or operating in assistant roles. Engineer, we have professional people, given the extent to which house prices outstrip local incomes. You know, we have professional people seeking to buy our shared ownership homes. We also have a lot of people employed in roles that are crucial to the sustainment of rural communities. So school, classroom assistants, teachers, nurses, public sector workers, as well as people employed within farming, people on apprenticeships, people in local hospitality. That word cloud, I think, gives you, and this is taken from real people that have bought our shared ownership homes in recent years. Can we go on to the next slide? Please, thank you. This is another word cloud that I've created, because when we sell people of those jobs that I've just described to you, when we sell homes to them, we say, why do you want to move? What is it that's attracted you to come here? And we have a lot of examples where people are wanting to move home. They want to move back to being close to family, to friends. Perhaps they want to start a family and want to be close to family support. Perhaps they want to move back to give care or support to an elderly relative. The extent to which people are priced out of the market means, sadly, that a lot of our young people have to move away from villages and small towns where they're born and when they grow up, in order to be able to access housing. But there does come a stage in their lives when they want to move back. And so we see a lot of that. We see a lot of people who are currently renting their home, who have that aspiration that I talked about to become a homeowner. A lot of people are currently overcrowded, so they're looking for larger homes. We see also a lot of what we call, well, some people call silver splitters. So that's middle-aged and older couples that are splitting up, their relationships, marriages are coming to an end, and the family home is being sold, and half the proceeds of that aren't enough to enable people to stay in their communities, but it is enough to put a sizable deposit down and raise a mortgage to buy a shared ownership home. So a real diversity of reasons, but actually I'd say kind of speaking to the warp and weft of rural communities and how they work and how they operate. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh, I've put some numbers against it. Yes. So of the people that are buying Broadacres shared ownership homes, just over a quarter have put relationship breakdown as the main reason. A good proportion, as we've said, to accommodate a growing family. Nearly 20% moving either to take up employment opportunities or to give or provide care. And 14% are setting up their first home together. So either young people or young couples coming together for the first time. And the average household income, that's the household income, is just over £38,000. So given that those incomes are often made up of those household incomes are often two people's incomes, you can see that the type of people that are buying our shared ownership are people on quite modest incomes and modest wages, allowing them that opportunity to access home ownership for the first time. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So if you're on that £38,500 income, what kind of mortgage might you be offered? Well, I went online to one of the well-known mortgage calculation websites, and what I learned was that you might be offered a mortgage of £134,000. But we can see, and there's an extract from another well-known property website, Rightmove, that says last year the average selling price of properties in the Yorkshire Dales was just over £330,000. So you can see, and I think everybody living and working in the Yorkshire Dales knows that it is an extremely expensive part of the world to live. So the people that we're offering home ownership opportunities for wouldn't really have the option to be able to buy homes any other way within the Yorkshire Dales. And just a note there, sold prices in the Yorkshire Dales over the last year were 6% up and 18% up on the 2020 peak. So it's that exponential growth really in house values and the increase in people being so comprehensively priced out of the market since COVID that we were talking about earlier. And one more slide, I think, please. So you might be offered a mortgage of £134,000 on that typical income. So what are your options for the ordinary people that we're renting for? Some planning authorities use the discount for sale product as an alternative to shared ownership. If we take that Yorkshire Dales average and we apply a 70% cap to it, so 70% is quite a common percentage of home to be sold under a discount for sale model, that would price that home at just under £232,000. And in order to access that, applicants would need a deposit of 10% typically for a mortgage for that product. So they'd need to be able to raise just over £23,000 worth of deposit. And then monthly mortgage payments would be £1,344 a month. By contrast, the same value property offered on a shared ownership basis, leveraging grant from the government like we do, allows us to offer a 25% share to somebody for just under £83,000, requiring a deposit of just over £8,000. The mortgage payment at current standard rates with a 10% deposit would be £480, and there'd be a rent of £554, meaning that the total monthly cost to that applicant for that same home would be £1,034. So £310 a month more to put into the local economy, to use to support a growing family, for people to be able to live their lives. So that's sort of on a page, really, taking the kind of average clients that we deal with our shared ownership product, applying it to your average Yorkshire Dales house value. That's the difference that we would say a shared ownership product can make in the local market, and why we think that it's not the true answer to affordable housing. Of course, we're always going to need to provide rented homes for people who either are unable or don't want to access owner occupation. But for those that do, we see the shared ownership product as being a helpful intervention in the market. And I think, unless I've got one more, that was my last slide, Sharon, I think. Are there any more slides, Rebecca, or was that it?
No, that was the last slide.
So that's kind of my quick canter through kind of what it's like to deliver homes across North Yorkshire. And I see we've had some questions in the chat, so I'm really happy to pick those up. I don't know, Peter, are you gonna?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Helen, for that. Some interesting points there, really useful stuff. The explanation of the rural exception sites is useful. That's going to be very relevant to us, particularly in finding sites in the Richmondshire area, and really helpful explanation of shared ownership. I learned quite a few things there, and what difference that product can actually make. We've got a number of questions, so I'll just work back through those. So the first question, I'll go back to David. David was asking, is it David Nolan? Was asking, does perpetuity provisions mean that the housing remains affordable to rent, or can it be handed on to rent by the family? So is that the difference between the old council housing where there could be a bit of succession?
Yeah, it depends on what the policy is of the provider. So I don't know, Helen, I don't know what Broadacre's succession policy is, but it would very much depend on what the policy is of whoever the provider was of the housing.
Yeah, I mean, normally I think because there is such a tremendous demand and need for social housing, and because the supply is not keeping track with that demand or need, I'm not sure of the detail of our succession policy, but if there, I'm pretty confident that it would mirror the typical policy of a local authority, which is that it is possible for the tenancy of a property to be handed over once, but then usually that's the end of it, because those homes need to go back in the pot and be allocated to people who need them rather than passed on. So, but when we talk about affordable housing in perpetuity, it means that the affordable nature of the property remains affordable forever, not that it necessarily gets kind of passed on.
Okay, thank you for that, Helen. Next question is from Yvonne. If planning allows market homes, will Homes England provide grant funding for the affordable housing? So that's about cross subsidy, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, on a rural exception site, subject to a business case, usually, but it's a bit of a thin end of the wedge argument. So I think it would almost be on a case-by-case basis, and Homes England would want to be assured that it was a genuinely affordable proposition in nature, rather than just an opportunity to get a market housing permission on a site with a few affordable homes.
Yeah, the issue being that obviously government doesn't want to subsidise private sector construction, does it? So that government money needs to be directed for where there's a genuine gap, perhaps in the financing that could otherwise be met through the market.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the amount of
Can I just come in? It's not for where you were going, Peter. It's for more my community-led housing, which is definitely not for landlord getting more money. It's more based on trying to get a community-led housing scheme. That's what I was going for. So maybe your answer, Helen, just could be right based on the fact that looking at a whole site to get affordable housing, which otherwise we wouldn't get. So thanks for that.
Can't speak for Homes England, not anymore. I used to work for them, but I don't anymore. But I believe that the policy does allow grant funding in certain circumstances. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we actually got it from Richard Painter. I think he nearly said that it was okay. So that's high up in Homes England anyway. But it's nothing like getting more information all the time. Thanks, Sir Helen.
Okay, thanks.
Your second question, Yvonne, is how wide does the survey go outside of the parish?
No, can it go outside? Very wide, I'm looking for, Peter.
I suppose that would be a conversation with the planning authority. So just to give some examples, we've done what we would call cluster surveys. We've got one in Rydale at the moment that we're doing. We've looked at that there were a couple of sites within a locality, so we discussed it with the planners and suggested a grouping of parishes that seemed to relate to these sites. So we've gone out and we've got a live survey there. Can't remember how many. I think there were maybe three parishes. So yeah, we have done it before, but it would be very much a conversation with the local planning authority to make sure that they were happy, and obviously the respective parish councils to make sure that that was something that they were comfortable with as well.
I think my question is based on the fact that we have so few sites that we can build on in the parks, that sometimes we have to use a site in not necessarily quite the right area to cover a wider area, so we can actually see some of these dales having affordable housing after listening to what you were saying on the survey.
Yeah.
So that's my fundamental point.
Yeah, from my perspective, yes. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear what Peter's views are, but yeah, definitely. And you're right, and it does help with the viability as well, because if we can identify a higher level of need through doing a bigger survey, that helps. So yes, absolutely. From our perspective, we would be happy to do that. But yeah, it's very much about what the planning authority thinks as well.
Yeah, and I think it is a conversation we do occasionally touch on with members. This very issue that Yvonne mentions, really, that because there is a shortfall of sites available, we have to look more broadly up and down the Dale, where it can sometimes figure is when you come to grant the planning permission and then determine the terms of the Section 106 agreement, which specifies who can actually occupy the property. If the evidence is based from the whole Dale, then really you're gonna need occupancy from the whole Dale and possibly beyond as well. So we just need to be a little bit flexible there. And I know sometimes there can be a few tensions around some of those issues, but yeah, if we're being flexible, we have to be quite flexible in terms of the occupancy as well, I would say. Just moving on, Councillor David Noland is asking, why are rural housing exception sites termed expensive to deliver? Is it to do with the payback time through rent or the cost of the build?
Yeah, it kind of is. They tend to cost more, David, because what do we know about rural exception sites? Well, they tend to be small in scale, so typically 12, 14 homes. So that's difficult to get in build terms, contracting terms, economies of scale. they tend to be, well, by definition, rural. So some of them can be quite remote. So they can be expensive to get materials to. Transport costs can be high. And again, you can't always guarantee you're going to get the sort of developer who would have a really efficient supply chain interested in wanting to build a 14-unit home. So you tend to go for smaller builders who don't have the sophisticated supply chain, so materials are higher, it's going to cost more to transport them. Planners, such as our friends in the room, quite rightly, often require enhanced specifications, the use of local stone, the use of, boundary treatments that are in fitting, in keeping with the local community. They can cost more. The combination of the scale and the quality that you want to build together with the cost inflation in the build market that we've seen certainly recently, together with the fact that although house prices are high in rural areas, there often isn't a very highly developed private rented sector. Many homes that are available to rent are often go to holiday let use. So it's quite difficult to kind of get a comparator in terms of setting a market rent against which some of our affordable rents are benchmarked. So the combination of high costs and difficulties with yield, rental income, mean that they can be quite challenging to make stack up, which is why we rely so strongly on the grant from Homes England. And as Sharon says, quite often the grant from local authorities as well to balance the books.
Okay. Next question is from Mark Corner. And Mark's asking, do we, the Yorkshire Dales National Park Authority, try to identify rural exception sites as part of our local plan site identification process? And then the second part of the question is, do we have a target for the number of sites, stroke dwellings, we would like to see as rural exception sites? The answer to that is no. We don't specifically try to identify rural exception sites, Mark. The idea is to try to retain flexibility for sites to come forward. I would say that that's why we identify housing development boundaries. We're not actually identifying the rural exception sites, but we're identifying the places where rural exception sites could take place rather than the actual sites themselves. What will happen, and sort of is happening as part of this local plan review, is that there are sites that are being put forward for allocation, but they're probably too small for allocation. So they're falling really certainly below the threshold of 5. And I think some of those sites will end up in the development boundary and could become rural exception sites, but we're not identifying them as such. So the actual process of looking for allocated sites de facto will end up meaning that the development boundaries are probably wider than they would otherwise be, and some of those will be options for rural exception sites. And we're very conscious of that in the north of the park, where we haven't had a good response to the call for sites for allocation. So I think we are hoping to not specifically to identify them, but to have opportunities for exception sites.
But Peter, the shared ownership model seems to be one of the few silver bullets I've heard that could help resolve the affordability crisis. And it seemed to me we should be playing a very proactive role in helping to identify where those sites could be, rather than being reactive to that. And I asked a subsequent question. I don't have a real feel for the materiality of this aspect of housing. So, for example, in the last 5 years, how many houses have been developed of this type on exception sites and classed as affordable?
Okay. Just to answer your first part of the question a little bit further, we're not identifying rural exception sites specifically through the local plan process, but we have been proactive in working with the rural housing enablers to suggest sites as rural exceptions. We've got to be a bit careful there, that we are playing by the rules and we are above board. But as we investigate sites for the local plan process, there are other sites that sort of fall off. So we can't put those into the local plan, but we can be proactive and have a conversation with the rural housing enablers who can then talk to the parish councils, talk to the landowner, and see if things can move forward. Your second point about how many shared ownership schemes have we had? Not many to date, I don't think. Were there any, Helen, on the West Whitton site?
No, that was a discount for sale model, I believe.
Right.
We're obviously delivering 5 shared ownership homes at Bainbridge on a rural exception site at the moment, and we have plans, irons in the fire, to be able to deliver across a number of rural exception sites in the park. But I won't say more about those just yet because I'm not in a position to confirm anything.
Can I just come back? 'Cause it didn't quite finish. Tell me what I needed, Peter, on the 25%. So is the rent actually there? You see, 25% as 70% discounted as you put up, it would have been 231,790,000. Shared ownership 231,790,000. But 25% that you are buying 25% of 328,000. So your house is worth, you're buying a house for 328,000, regardless of what your monthly payment is. You're having to pay under shared ownership on what you put up, Helen.
Yeah.
You're actually buying a house that's costing 328,000, not one that's costing 231,000. So you pay 231,000 outright, fine, with a mortgage. Whereas on shared ownership, you're paying 328,000. And I'm very bothered about this, because what I'm saying is, would you, any of you on this site, I'm going to have that house. Well, I'm going to pay nearly, working it out, I'm going to pay £90,000 more for it than somebody else might be paying for it. So do you see my point? I know you can't answer me because it's not right, but what I did ask, the question I really was asking was on your 10%, because you keep promoting 10%, is the rent, is it the social rent that you'd be normally paying Broadacres for just a house, affordable house to rent?
No, it's a different rent setting regime, Yvonne. So I won't bore you with the detail, but a social rent is a rent that's set by a formula based on the value of the property in 1999, multiplied by an uplift, multiplied by various other socioeconomic factors around the place. It's much simpler on the shared ownership rent. On the unsold equity, it's a subsidised rent. It's at we won't go above 2.75% of the unsold equity. So hence that was what I used in the illustration that I gave to show costs.
So in other words, the rent you pay, say you were renting a 3-bedroom house or 2-bedroom house from Broadacres, and it is going to be cheaper renting that than it is, of course, to what you're buying at 10%, correct?
I think it depends on the value of the property. It depends on the value of the property.
I know, I'm not happy with it. You know that. Some people say it's brilliant. The only thing I would say is, the important point to me is get them sold and don't end up renting them out. Get them sold. That's the main thing to me. Sorry about that, Peter. I know you would hate me coming in with that.
No. This is the opportunity of this meeting, isn't it? Is to actually ask these sort of questions and get it straight in our own mind. How it's working. Right. So that answers your question about the
Councillor Myers wanted to come in, Peter.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, sorry, it was really on Yvonne's point. Yvonne, we've done shared ownership in Creighton. They've done it in Harrogate. Broadacres do it. It's hugely popular. It is a real opportunity for people who otherwise couldn't get onto the housing ladder to do it. And actually, my understanding is, and Helen will know this, and if I'm wrong, she'll tell me, is that effectively it doesn't work out in most cases any more expensive than a private rent, certainly. And in some cases it's considerably cheaper. And I'm not sure that the idea that it is overall more expensive in terms of the cost of your house is correct. Actually, I don't think that's right. But anyway, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong on that. But it is basically a very good model of enabling those who, under normal circumstances, couldn't borrow that money to do it. It's also, as it happens, it's a good business model for housing providers and for councils as well. It actually is quite a good return on your investment, but it does meet a need. Where I disagree with Mark is it's not the magic one to the housing crisis in the national parks or North Yorkshire more generally, because you are always going to have people who don't wish to or can't afford to involve themselves in any type of purchase of property. So you're always going to need affordable and social rents.
Okay.
Can I
Peter,
butt
sorry,
in? Do you mind if I butt in there?
Go ahead, David. Yeah.
I'm putting my maths teacher head on here. Excuse me. We saw, I think we were looking at a house costing 220,000. It refers to Yvonne's point. So Yvonne was saying it seemed to be cheaper to go the other route. And we saw a 70% being quoted as 231,000. And therefore, apparently, I think this is where the mistake is, 10% would be 23,100. If 70% is 231,000, then 100% is nearer 330,000.
Yeah, Councillor.
So I think there's a mistake in the. I think it's wrong to say the 10% is 23,100, because the 10% you quote is 10% of the 70% figure, and anybody who hates maths is probably switched off by now. I'm sure Neil Swain, with his money head, good numbers head, could just understand what I'm talking about. So I think there's a mistake in the figures. They're not clear enough. I think that's the problem. So that comparably, the two houses, Helen, that you're quoting are actually the same price. They're not. Nobody's getting the cheaper version.
David, they are the same price. So I was taking the average transaction price of houses in the Yorkshire Dales last year or this year, which was 332, and then comparing two scenarios. One is them offered on a discount for sale basis, which 70% of 332 is 220 something, or alternatively having them offered on a shared ownership basis with an initial first tranche sale of 25% and then rent on the remaining. So I was using those two scenarios.
Yeah, I just think your 10% figure should have been 33,000, but maybe we can all move on. But I think it's the 10% figures that's wrong.
10%. I didn't quote a 10% figure. I've quoted a 25% figure for the first tranche sale.
I think the issue, David, is that it was 10% of the selling price, which is a 70% discount. You then need a 10% deposit of your 70% discounted price, which is the 23,000.
Thank you. Yes.
I was basing it quite simply on 82,000 is what you said. No, I was basing it on the 25%. If you multiplied that by 4, you got to 328,000. So near enough. So consequently, if you'd bought it at 70% below that, your actual house, you're only paying 231,000 for it. But if you went all the way up to 80%, you'd be 80% of the 328,000. But I think the big problem with it is that you cannot, under the rules of how many thousand people live in this area, government rules, we can't go up to 100%. I think if you could go up to 100%, which of course we can't, then it wouldn't matter the same that it was dearer. It's the fact that you can only go to 80%, but in actual fact, it's always going to be 80% of the higher, because it's 80% at market price, whereas it's 70% below market price. Well, you don't need to be the mathematician, David, to work out that if you're only paying 70% of the market price for your house overall, regardless of how often, how many times you pay quarter or half, you're actually paying more for your 25% than you would if you'd been saying paying 25% of the 70% with that off. I know you can't do that, Helen, but I'm just making the point that shared ownership means that your house is worth, you're paying more for it. So consequently, if you're selling it for life up to 80%, you paid more for it. That was my point. And
So
that's
Yvonne,
been
it does. So stop looking at the figures and just please. Helen will tell you. I'll tell you. Sharon will tell you. They do not cost more. Yeah, they do not cost more.
They do.
Don't look at the figures. They don't cost more. The figures may be wrong or the emphasis is wrong, but or whatever. But they don't cost more.
And I think also, Councillor, that part of the issue is that even at a 70% of open market value, very many local people on local incomes wouldn't be able to afford a mortgage to service that amount, or find the deposit necessary to get such a mortgage. Our average shared owners, the average wages of our shared owners would enable them to get a mortgage of £134,000. That's all.
Please prove me wrong next door. That's my point. Rosencrown next door.
Richard, you've got a question to ask or a point to make?
It's just a point on that really. Shared ownership, houses in the Dales are not cheap. You know, we've just seen 320,000. There's one down from me on the market at the moment at 360,000 for a one up, one down with a loft conversion and a back kitchen. You know, whether it'll sell at that, I don't know. But we've really got to be realistic that out of planning and out of what the housing associations are doing, we're not building cheap houses to buy for local people. It's not a thing we can do. We're not doing that. We're trying to find ways of getting people so they can buy what are expensive houses, and it's really, really difficult to do that, and even to give people that opportunity. You know, if you want to buy a cheap house, unfortunately, still you're going to have to go to Colne, or you're going to have to go into Lancashire somewhere in order to pick one up, or West Yorkshire somewhere in order to pick a cheap house up. It's not hard. We can't make these houses cheap, because if we do, then we're basically subsidising the market, and we're not allowed to do that, unfortunately. So that's my point, really, Peter.
Thank you, Richard, for that. I'm going to move on to Derek Tynes' point, and this is about staircasing, and Derek's asking, what's the actual evidence, what's the frequency, what's the extent of experience of people staircasing up? Is that correct, yeah. Derek?
Yeah, he's given us a thumbs up. Okay, so the short answer to the question is that it's starting to happen more and more. Shared ownership has been around for a long time as a product, but certainly in the north of England, it's only relatively recently that it started to take off and become more mainstream. Back in the early days of the programme in this part of the world, the level of staircasing was very small because it wasn't promoted, and it was a very, very small part of the social housing landscape. Whereas in recent years, for example, we sold some shared ownership homes over in Malton on the other side of the county, and we saw a lot of local professionals, nurses, teachers come and buy sort of 25-30%, and then within sort of 18 months had staircased to much more significant chunks of equity. The beauty of being able to buy a small chunk of equity to start with is that you need a very small deposit. We often find that people, particularly if they're in private rented accommodation, they could be earning good money, but they're spending all their money on rent, so they really struggle to save a deposit. And if they don't have access to the bank of mum and dad, then that can be a real barrier. The reality is that they could probably afford to service a much larger mortgage, but it's the deposit requirements that prevent it. Being able to buy a smaller initial tranche of shared ownership and then subsequently exercise that right to staircase is really, really attractive to people. And we expect to see a lot more staircasing in future.
Can I follow with a supplementary on that, hearing that, because, okay, we're beginning to see it happen. In your model of the partnership of what you provide and what comes in with the rent, as someone staircases, possibly up to 80–90%, even more. Are there penalties for them? What happens in the change of relationships, or if they want to come out of it?
There's no penalty. They obviously, the more equity you buy, the less rent you pay on the unsold equity. So it's beneficial in that regard. Although actually, with interest rates being the way as they are, if it was up to me, I'd rather pay a 2.75% subsidised rent than a mortgage at 6% interest rate. So there's no penalty. They obviously, when they choose to exercise the right to staircase, the property gets revalued. So if it's gone up in value, they buy whatever the percentage is of the current value. Equally, if the property value has fallen, it will cost them less proportionately. From our perspective, in terms of our business model, we have to pay back a proportion of the grant or recycle a proportion of the grant to Homes England. At the moment, because the shared ownership product is still, we only own about 300 shared ownership properties in our stock. We don't make assumption about any staircasing income in our business model, but we're keeping a very close eye on that, and we may build that in the future. I hope that answered your question. Thank you, Helen. That's right. Back to David. David's got a couple of questions. I think the first one is, if families are splitting into smaller units, doesn't that mean that we need, I think you're asking for, does that mean we need smaller apartments rather than bigger houses that take up more space? Is that right, David? Right, so who's going to answer that? Yes. Should I answer that?
Do you want me to come in, Peter? Because just to say, Helen will be very familiar with this because we've had a lot of conversations about this in terms of not just inside the park, but outside the park. The need for smaller 1–2 bed homes is across the patch. So yes, that, I would say as a rule, yes, the profile of the provision needs to be weighted more to smaller homes. But that has to be balanced against viability, yet again, which is more challenging on rural sites. And Helen might want to come and say something about this, because obviously we've got to be able to make the development stack up financially. But yes, there is a need to reflect that in the kind of homes and the sizes of homes. And I think, did that come out in your the piece of work that you had done by Three Dragons as well, from memory?
Yes, it did. It did. It's getting that balance. We definitely do need 1 and 2 person modern flats effectively in the park.
Yeah, and it's a really common thing across North Yorkshire, because it's the sort of homes that the market aren't providing, isn't it? Market developers tend not to provide smaller homes, tend not to provide bungalows, for example. This is a space that we occupy increasingly because it's about the right homes in the right place. Sharon's right, it doesn't cost that much less to build a 1-bedroom place than it does a 2-bedroom, but obviously the amount of rent you can get is much less for a 1-bedroom property than a 2. So there is a bit of a challenge with the viability, but we're not in it for the money, we're in it for doing the right thing for communities. So we are committed to building smaller homes.
My point, if I can come in there, is that if you're building an apartment blocks, might be a converted mill, but something, you can build more homes on the same site. It's denser, so surely that improves the viability of it.
You can, and obviously if we're talking about social rent, where people are given only the size of property that their family circumstances dictate they need, then it's a bit different. But if we're talking about selling properties, many people would want to have a spare bedroom. They'd want to have older people would want to have a spare room, perhaps for visiting grandchildren. Younger people may want to have an office to work from home. So we have to think in terms of need, but also demand when we're developing homes for shared ownership.
Okay, David, another question here. With the big demand to move back near where people were born, does the National Park Authority, should we be looking to build in rural areas to rejuvenate them rather than on the edge of the Dales in established towns or already large villages. Not quite sure I understand your point there. What's the point?
Partly connected to housing consultation number 6, for example. But if the point is that from the research, it's found that people want to move back nearer to where their parents live or grandparents live, then that would reinforce the argument for building in more rural areas rather than where the West Yorkshire where they've moved to for somewhere affordable. I know somebody's going to tell me that those sites aren't coming forward, but as much as we like, but surely if that we should be looking more to rejuvenate the areas and people are looking to move back anyway. So isn't that an argument to reinforce building in more rural areas? Is that clear or not?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do with the local plan. We are trying to allocate sites across the park where those sites are available. We are a deeply rural area. You know, we could have had a strategy, I suppose, of saying, well, we're not going to build any housing in the national park. Let's let it all go into Skipton or Richmond or Kirkby Stephen, you know, because there are better services there. But we're not following that option because we are trying to meet some of that need in the rural area. I mean, yeah. So I think that's what we're doing. We will be challenged on that strategy, no doubt, the local plan examination. But I think what you describe is what we are trying to do. Unfortunately, you know, we have partnerships with associations like Broadacres who seem to be keen to help deliver in some of those settlements as well. So we've had the scheme in West Witton. Broadacres are on site in Sebba, our largest town, still a rural area, and we've had success in places like Long Preston as well. Question from Mark Corner. How material could it be for homes on rural exception sites in the national park? How many homes have we developed in, say, the past 5 years? Right. Okay. So this was mentioned before. Well, it's not enough. The recent exception schemes, I suppose, there's the Rose and Crown in Bainbridge. The part of the scheme in Sebba, it's a bit complicated, but part of the scheme in Sebba is regarded as an exception site, albeit a kind of larger one. It's partly because we've had a checkered history on rural exceptions sites that we've gone down the road of trying to allocate sites, because there are advantages of having bigger sites. But really, our strategy is to try and do both. It's to keep the rural exceptions policy open, but try and see what we can achieve through market-led sites as well.
If it's a good thing, I don't see why we don't have a target and try to really make it happen.
I suppose if we got into an argument at the examination and we had a target for all exception sites, the inspector might say, well, I would prefer a more planned approach rather than just leaving it to sort of unplanned rural exception sites.
No, but why can't we plan them? Why can't we say that this is a way of people being able to afford to live in the Dale? So we're going to actively promote and facilitate the identification and delivery of exception sites.
I think that's where we're going to get to, Mark, with the discussion we're having with the local plan advisory group. It's pretty apparent that we don't have that cover. We don't have the distribution of sites for allocation. So I think that's exactly what we're going to do. What you've just said is having a kind of project management-led approach to rural exception sites in the north of the park. I mean, this is the work that the RHEs under Sharon are already set up to do. So what we're talking about is just, from our point of view, giving that an even bigger push, really. Do you want to say anything about that, Sharon? Or
I think Richard's waiting to come in.
Okay, go ahead, Richard.
It's just, Mark, if you plan them, then they're not exceptions, they're planned sites, so therefore they become part of the local plan. So it is a bit that we know we're going to need to use exception sites in order to get the housing numbers, and I think that's becoming really apparent to the working group that we're not going to deliver the housing numbers just on the allocated sites. And so therefore I think that one of the discussions we are going to come back to you with is how we utilize exception sites and how we justify having those in the plan, especially for that northern part of the district where we haven't got the planned sites, and how we're going to justify and bring forward and make sure we do deliver housing on those smaller scale sites and in the areas where we haven't got the larger sites. And then obviously we've got to be able to finance those sites so they do actually come forward and deliver houses. It's not an easy thing probably to do, and at the end of the day we've got to explain that to the inspector and make sure that he or she goes along with that we are actually going to deliver somewhere near the 750. I think my question probably will be is where we are with housing needs surveys and the RHE programme, and in some of those areas where either exception sites or where we're planning housing delivery, and is there some work we should be doing together, Sharon, at the moment in order to justify our houses?
Yeah, and there's just if it's helpful, the North York Moors, we work with the North York Moors on really just most of their deliveries around rural exception sites. So there's probably some conversations we could have there about what they do and how we might look to replicate some of that work, because we do have like a list of potential sites, and we will try to work with parishes in those localities to see if we can bring those sites forward or work with them around needs surveys. But we've also been having a wider conversation across the piece with partners around and planning colleagues, primarily the two national parks, looking around what is acceptable in terms of the needs surveys and evidence, because we don't always get, I suppose you've got to see housing needs surveys as one part of the puzzle, but it can actually in and of itself cause a problem. And we know from our experience of delivering rural exception sites across many years and across the patches that we might not get a high response rate, but then we'll go and do a community consultation event, or we might have a follow-up once we've got some plans and we identify more needs. So I think it's about working together to think about how we want to do that, and also from your perspective thinking about, well, where are and alongside, I think this is where linking in with Councillor Myers around, what are those priorities for North Yorkshire Council in terms of some of those settlements that really you think are the most sustainable, where we want to target and prioritise trying to bring forward sites. So that's something I think, yeah, definitely we can work together on doing something around that.
Yvonne?
Actually, it was quite interesting, because listening to what you're saying about exception sites going, doing more with them. The Upper Dales Community Land Trust, which I'm a director of, or trustee, or whatever you call it, we desperately didn't want to, not interested at all in the local plan sites, which is why we haven't even put anything in, because we are very much will be based on exception sites, because they're the sites that the landowner will sell us it at the right price. So, you can be very careful. You don't end up having landowners coming along and, oh, well, they're interested in my site. Because we, as Peter knows, we won't go into that, but, we have a site, we're looking at it, it's not going to be in the local plan. And, that site is a site that we can actually turn into an exception site, because it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the local plan or exception site, landowners releasing land is the big problem we have, so that is our problem. And so to me, if we ever, I'm sorry, I'll put it quite bluntly, if we can ever get a landowner to let us have some land at the right price, well, I just hope the planning committee are very favourable, let's put that way, to us. That's about it.
Thank you, Yvonne. Neil Heseltine is asking about shared ownership. So going back to shared ownership, and Neil's asking how popular is that as a model with the construction industry, and does that work financially for them too? So question probably to Helen, I guess.
I think, yes, I mean, it does. I think the ability to leverage government grant plugs the gap between the costs of build and land and the proceeds, the first tranche sale return, and then the subsidised rent on the remainder. It does need grant funding to make it stack up. It tends to be registered providers of social housing associations that deliver the shared ownership product, although there are some for-profit organisations coming into this market, because it is, as one of the councillors mentioned, it does work well in financial appraisal. It does work well in business plan terms for organisations. So historically, it's been a housing association, a social housing product, but increasingly the commercial market is waking up for the fact that it is a good thing to do, because the demand for it in certain markets like North Yorkshire is almost limitless, isn't it? That squeezed middle, those people who would never dream or think of themselves as being eligible for or wanting social housing, but nonetheless, because of the really high differential between wages and prices, are priced out of the housing market.
Thanks for that, Helen. Can I just have a follow-up to that, please, Peter?
Yeah.
So if they work for the people who are buying the houses potentially, and they work for the construction industry, going back to Mark's point, why isn't that something that we as a national park would say, this is the route that we need to go down, and include them in the local plan, and not necessarily include them just on exception sites? Why don't we just say shared ownership is a way to go? I know Yvonne might not necessarily agree with that, but why isn't that something that we should look at more closely and to a greater degree?
Well, I mean, my answer to that would be, it's the evidence we've got is that it is important for a sector, but there are always going to be people who are not going to be able to afford shared ownership, and those people are going to need decent quality rental accommodation, and there are advantages to that in terms of people's ability to move on and not have to sell a property, in terms of the amount of money they've got to do other things in their life. We've got a particular issue with businesses trying to get people on contract work, and on very low wages, and we need a number of responses there. We need flats, we need affordable housing. We also need the local market to get more active in terms of houses in multiple occupation as well, bed sits really, if they can be managed properly. So shared ownership's part of it. Sharon, what's your view on the different tenures?
I think I was just going to say, I can't work out how to put my hand up, so you're probably really pleased about that, because I can't. But I would just say, I know that you had some research done that looked at need and demand across the park, and normally when you're looking to set your supplementary planning document, part of your local plan process, you would look at what that tells you need in the different areas, and generally, as a rule of thumb, it's a mix. So it might be, for example, the former Hambleton District Council local plan, the housing requirement there in terms of affordable housing was split a third, which was a third shared ownership, a third affordable rent, and a third social rent. So on every market site that came forward, that was a qualifying site, so it was above the threshold where you needed to provide affordable housing, that's what should be provided on the site. So it's probably something similar, and I would be looking to what your evidence tells you and then formulating your policy response accordingly. So you may well find that is an element of it, so it will be a mix. because like you said, you've got a whole range of responses that are needed, and so there'll be different things. And shared ownership, not, you know, in its simplest terms, you need some kind of affordable rented product and some kind of low cost home ownership response. And I think that the one thing about shared ownership is that it allows you access into some form of housing and home ownership at a lower income level than you can get with a discount market sale product. And I think with the exponential rise in house prices, that is why it has become more of an important option for us when we're looking at the profile of need and demand in our localities. So I'm really sorry, Peter, I don't know your evidence base well enough to be able to say what that is, but yeah, it would be a mixed response.
The figure of 60-40 is in my head, actually. But the other thing that's now being thrown in is first homes as well, which is the government scheme. So I'll have to factor that in.
And that is effectively a discount market sale product, really.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go to Richard, and then
thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Thinking about winding it up after that. Thank you, Neil.
Yeah, just to say, Neil, it will be a mix. I think where your problems come in is if you're doing an exception type, say 4 houses, and you've got one rented that are housing associations running, you've got one that was first time buyer isn't affordable because that counts as affordable now, or 2 that were first time buyer, and then you've got one that's a shared ownership, and then who's actually going to manage these houses? Because, you know, if there's a leaky gutter I'm just thinking for Broadacres, then they're driving vans all over the Yorkshire Dales Potential National Park doing little bits of jobs, whereas if you're on a larger scale site, they can turn up and they might have 4 repairs to do on that site on that day or whatever, and it becomes easier for them to manage their properties. So it does become more difficult on those exception sites if you've got a mix of tenures. But yeah. I do get that we're going to have to build houses for all people, if you know what I mean. And some people, social rent's the only way forward. Some people, an affordable rent will work, and some people. So yeah, and it is part of our plan, Neil.
Yeah, no, and that's fair enough, and I get exactly what you're saying. I'm just wondering, and this might be a completely naive suggestion, but could we, for example, use shared ownership where, say, for example, on the Sedbergh site where there's open market housing, could we use shared ownership in that instance instead of the open market? So you're creating all sorts of different opportunities for affordable and social rent, but also shared ownership, and taking the open market stuff out of the equation completely. I don't know whether that's an option at all, but that's just what's going through my mind, having heard what I've heard today.
That's what we're doing on Sedbergh, is we're doing all that. We're doing open market, we're doing shared ownership, which is hugely popular. We're doing affordable rent, and we're doing social rent. So we're doing all 4.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thanks, Alan.
Okay. Thank you. Just Mark's Corner, just before I wind it up, Mark's Corner's made a comment about following up Sharon's suggestion, North York Moors. We are in discussion with North York Moors. The difference there is that they seem to have more scope for rural exceptions. It's a different landscape. Villages are a lot flatter. They have better sites available, and it also seems to have more amenable landowners as well, and a lot more rural estates who seem prepared to come forward with land. But certainly we can always talk to them and learn lessons. Okay, unless anybody has any burning questions, I'd just like to thank Sharon and thank Helen for your very useful presentations. I know we talk about affordable housing a lot, but we should do, because it's important, and it is an area where we can make a little bit of difference. So thank you very much to them, and thank you, members, once again for an excellent quality of questions, which officers have found challenging. So that's great. So thank you very much indeed. And
can I just ask Peter, can we have the slides sent through to us?
Yes, I'm sure we can.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll circulate those via Rebecca. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, members.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye.